Welcome back. If you've been following along in the class, you know that we just finished up our discussion on the Watergate scandal. And one of the things that I'm hopeful that you were left with as far as that lecture goes is how, on the one hand, it contributed to this growing credibility gap that the government allegedly suffered from. The government wasn't being truthful with the American people. That was kind of confirmation of that. On the other hand, it was very damaging to the American psyche when it comes to politics, that the government was knowingly and actively doing stuff like this. In any case, once Richard Nixon resigns, the guy that takes over for him is a guy from Michigan by the name of Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford's first order of business was to pardon Richard Nixon. Now, some of you may know what a presidential pardon is, some of you may not. For those of you that do not know, this is basically the president issuing somebody a get-out-of-jail-free card. Maybe a better way of looking at it in the context of Nixon would be you don't have to go in court and face the music. Maybe you beat the case and maybe you don't, but the simple fact of the matter was what Richard Nixon had been doing throughout Watergate was amounting to obstruction of justice, which is not only an impeachable offense, but also a criminal offense. So anyway, it's one thing to know that Nixon was doing this, and it's another thing to know that his understudy, I guess you could call him, Jerry Ford, his vice president, basically just let him completely off the hook. Okay. Now you would think that this would be just the scandal, just the about face that the Democrats needed to really turn that tide back in their favor and once again establish themselves as a dominant party. But keep in mind, the big figures, the big names of the Democratic Party are gone. Both Kennedys have been assassinated at this point. Lyndon Johnson's not available any longer. It's going to be years before you hear the names of people like Teddy Kennedy or individuals like that. But in any case, everybody, I need you to understand that this was a very traumatic time as far as a lot of Americans were concerned politically. That being said, I don't want you to get the idea that there's nothing going on. As a matter of fact, there's quite a lot going on with respect to social movements and even political movements that are beginning to grow during this period. We've talked quite extensively about the civil rights movement in various forms, in various fashions, in various contexts and settings. What we really haven't talked about in any kind of really direct manner would be the women's movement, the feminist movement. Now keep in mind, guys, in our class, a social movement is a movement of people that is designed to empower a group, be that people of color, or in this case women, that have up until this point largely been powerless. And so in the case of women, this is really an outgrowth of the civil rights movement in the sense that some of the hardest working activists within SCLC, within various other civil rights organizations, just so happen to be women. The fact of the matter was, though, they were expected to make the coffee as the guys were making all of the decisions. And a lot of women began asking themselves, here I am pounding the pavement for someone else's civil rights. Who's out there, campaigning for mine? Okay? We are still talking about a time period where women couldn't do the same sorts of jobs that men were open to. Okay? One of the individuals that I'd like you to know about to that end would be a feminist by the name of Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan wrote this book in the early 1960s called The Feminine Mystique. Now, in ways you can kind of see that as a 20th century version of the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood, the idea that there are separate spheres, separate roles for men and women to play in American life. I always like to look at this as the glass ceiling in American life, that while on the surface level we like to say as a society, of course women can do everything, of course women are man's equal, right? But realistically there are jobs and other opportunities that are simply off limits to women. It's a spoken and understood, not written sort of scenario, okay? Betty Friedan and feminists that thought like her ultimately formed an institution that will come to be known as the National Organization for Women, or NOW. And now still around today, and you hear about it every once in a while. For example, the National Football League has a no-tolerance policy with respect to domestic violence. And when in the past there has been a player that has violated this policy, it's now that puts a lot of pressure on the NFL to really hold them accountable and enforce those sorts of measures, right? But anyway, what Now wanted in the late 1970s was the reestablishment of, if you remember me talking about this in the 1920s, the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. What this would do is it would amend the Constitution to say that with respect to sex, there is no difference between men and women. Think about the 14th Amendment that basically says you have equal protection and equal access to the law. It's colorblind. I mean, the 14th Amendment doesn't take race, creed, color, national origin, or religiosity into account when it comes to protection under the law, and that's what feminists like Betty Friedan wanted the ERA to do. Equal protection, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. Put that in the back of your mind for a minute, because this is not going to be the last time that we're going to talk about ERA. Part of what the feminists were trying to do was to change the nature of American culture. And I don't just mean, when it comes to chores, boys take out the garbage and they mow the lawns, and girls fold laundry and they do dishes. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, that is part of this, but really, if you're following along with me, if you're on that PowerPoint slide entitled The Women's Movement, there's a photograph of two feminists that are crashing a Miss America pageant, and they've got this poster of a naked lady, and she is marked up the very similar way that you would see a cow marked up if you walked into a butcher shop, a diagram of a cow, that is. In other words, there's the loin, and there's round, and there's shoulder and chuck, and I don't think you really need to have a PhD in American history to understand where they were going with this, that women are objects, and they're objects for the pleasures of men's sexuality to be consumed through institutions like Miss America. And so, this is driving at the point that Miss America is essentially misogynistic and male-oriented and, undermining females, generally speaking, in American life, but it also hearkened to this double standard of American life. The idea that when it comes to American sexuality, there were things that men could do, just like in the job market, that women just couldn't do, lest they risk their reputation being absolutely annihilated. In any case, all of this leads us into a 1973 Supreme Court case ruling entitled Roe versus Wade. Okay? Now, I suspect many of you have heard of this. Many of you maybe even know what this is, but for your notes, the Roe versus Wade decision in 73 legalizes the institution of abortion. Now, let me make something clear. Abortions existed before 1973. It's just that they were not legal, right? What this is going to do is it's going to define a woman's body as her own property, and as such, she has the right to determine what will ultimately happen to that property. Put another way, what Roe leads to is something that we call the pro-choice movement. You have a choice to terminate a pregnancy if you want to. Now, the feminists are going to argue that what this is going to amount to is leveling the playing field between men and women. Keep in mind, it's ladies that get pregnant, it's not men that get pregnant. And ultimately, the expectation in American life, certainly in the 1970s, to some extent we still have this, is the mother would be the nurturer of the child and raise the child. Meanwhile, the man is out still in public making decisions. Feminists are going to say that what the Roe decision is ultimately going to lead to is a leveling of the playing field, because this is going to give women their own self-determination with respect to whether or not they're going to carry that child to term. Okay. Now, the Roe decision was considered to be quite a breakthrough for the feminist movement, but I would also be very quick to point out that it's reawakening what from 1925 to 1973 had been a sleeping giant. The last time we really talked about evangelical Christians in American politics was the Scopes Monkey trials with that cultural war of the 1920s. Keep in mind, there was a provision in Dayton, Tennessee, that said you could not teach the theories of evolution in Dayton classrooms. Well, this guy John Scopes does that. He gets arrested for it, and although he loses the case, his defense attorney so successfully humiliated evangelical Christians, they were so embarrassed by what he did to them in 1925, that they really don't, show their faces in American electoral politics really for the next several decades. In any case, the combination of American feminism, the idea of women out there in the job market, women exerting much more power to what these individuals consider to be an unhealthy level, combined with the Supreme Court saying that you can now terminate a pregnancy, which to groups of religious Americans, evangelical Christians, conservative Catholics, Jewish people, Mormons, and I'm using the term religious people broadly speaking, this really was seen as the U.S. government really speaking for the wrong thing, that what the government was actually standing for was an excuse to be promiscuous, an excuse to kill an unborn child. And so what I need you to understand here is that the feminist movement, and the Roe versus Wade decision in particular, is going to give rise to a movement that we're going to call the religious right. Terribly, terribly important term for you to understand, not just in the context of our class, although it is. I'm talking about the lives that we live in the 21st century. The religious right remains a very important voting bloc, especially for the Republican Party. As the PowerPoint demonstrates, these are individuals that are going to be defined officially as social conservatives. They're conservative on issues involving not only feminism and abortion, but also later on same-sex marriage and LGBT community generally speaking. Okay, they generally gravitate to the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party is really going to begin, especially in the late 1970s, begin to define itself as the family, or the party of family values. And just like Richard Nixon's silent majority, the religious right is going to become a cornerstone of the Republican Party for the foreseeable future. There are individuals that understand the power that potentially can be made out of this reawakening of the religious right. One of those individuals is a guy by the name of Jerry Falwell. Falwell is an individual that will later be credited for creating this institution known as the moral majority. And essentially what this was a conservative Christian political interest group. But like La Causa with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, in the process of this reawakening, it's going to be Jerry Falwell that registers hundreds of thousands of evangelical Christians to vote. Chavez is doing the same thing, and other people with the Chicano movement. This is going to be kind of a similar development, and the religious right is not going to be, this kind of right-wing kind of kook show when it comes to American politics. They're going to be taken very, very serious. And even though they're going to largely appeal to Republican candidates, they will have an impact on Democratic candidates as well. Another individual that I'd like you to be mindful of would be Pat Robertson. Um, Pat Robertson, some of you may know who I'm talking about. Some of you may have seen his show, The 700 Club. For those of you that haven't, the 700 Club began more or less as a Christian variety show to raise money for various charities. They would have performers, musicians, magicians, jugglers, you name it, on their show, and people would call in to make donations and pledges for one cause or another. Over the course of time, however, the 700 Club kind of became similar to what you have with Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update, or maybe better yet, The Daily Show. Now, if you watch The Daily Show, or you used to watch The Daily Show, you know that that's basically comedy. It is, it's comedy, but it's through kind of a news sort of venue. That was the 700 Club put together by Pat Robertson. It was a news show, but through the lens of evangelical Christianity. In any case, what I'd like you to understand about the religious right, and if you take nothing more away from it than this, I need you to understand that it is the reemergence of evangelical Christianity in American politics, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's going to be a very, very important development in American politics, especially when we consider this whole idea of a shift, political shift in American life. Okay? Back to ERA for a second. You know, ERA seemed like a can't miss, a slam dunk, whatever sports analogy you want to indulge here. There are a lot of people that just assume that it was gonna, and nobody was gonna resist writing it right there into the Constitution. What they hadn't anticipated was this female lawyer by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who, on the surface level, you would expect her to be a big supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment that says, Harvard and Yale law schools can't simply discriminate against me, a woman law student, simply because I'm a woman. But she was a staunch opponent of ERA. Phyllis Schlafly organized a movement that came to be known as Stop ERA. And generally speaking, the reason that they were opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment is they said that it was going to destroy the dignity of womanhood. It was going to produce what Schlafly considered to be this odd, this weird unisex society where there's very little difference between men and women. That would lead to all these unhappy results, including, same-sex bathrooms, or unisex bathrooms, rather. Women that could potentially be drafted into the military. Keep in mind, if there's nothing legally that separates men from women, there's nothing from stopping this from happening. Later on, she said it could even lead to things like same-sex marriage. And so, generally speaking, what Schlafly is able to put together is a lot of these evangelical Christians that saw ERA as a fundamental threat to what they considered to be the biblical family. And by biblical, I'm kind of including all groups, if you understand what I'm saying. I'm not just meaning the Christians, right? And so in any case, what happens through the efforts of Phyllis Schlafly and the activists that she brings together into American politics is ERA is once again tabled. Just like in the 1920s, it's largely American women that are responsible for its defeat. And Schlafly is a perfect example of what I'm talking about to that end. On the flip side of the coin, we've talked about a conservative movement. I want to end our discussion here today talking about a liberal movement. There are individuals, and Lyndon Johnson is one of these individuals, that say, look, you can't just pass a civil rights or a voting rights act and expect people of color, people that have been held down by hundreds of years of institutionalized oppression, to just kind of lift themselves up and make it. When you've not only been, terrorized to stay in your place through violence, but also you've been discriminated out of the institutions that tend to lend themselves to middle-class life and security. Banking, for example, education, another good example. You can really appreciate how it would be really, really difficult in an instant anyway to kind of lift yourself up and achieve middle-class life. What Lyndon Johnson was a proponent of is a policy that we call affirmative action. And again, I'm willing to bet that a lot of you have heard of this policy known as affirmative action. What it was designed to do, more than anything else, was provide some sort of foundation for racial, ethnic, religious, political minorities that up until this point had had a hard time breaking into these institutions that lent themselves to upward mobility. It was designed, above and beyond anything else, it was designed to promote diversity. Diversity in the workplace, diversity in higher education, diversity in American life. Now, the way that it was designed to work was if you had two equally qualified candidates, it's at that point that you can take diversity into consideration. An institution like the University of Texas or the University of Michigan, for example, they place a high value on diversity because in addition to learning from the professor, learning from your classes, you generally learn from the people around you, both in a classroom setting and also in just a campus or university setting. That's partly why institutions of higher learning really do value diversity, because it gives you a different perspective on something, and it really lends itself to the idea of learning. In any case, it was not designed to be a quota system. Okay, it was not designed to say, well, I only have 3 Canadians on the campus of the University of Houston, and so therefore what I'm really going to do is I'm going to try to bang up those numbers to better reflect this idea of diversity. That's not really the way that it was supposed to be implemented. The problem is, over the course of time, it will be implemented that way. A case in point would be Atlanta. In the late 1970s, and Maynard Jackson, who is not only going to be Atlanta's mayor, Maynard Jackson is going to be the first African-American man to be elected mayor of any major southern city, in this case Atlanta. Now, in addition to being a major southern city, probably the largest, it's also the most densely African-American populated city, right? Biggest black population really in the country when you're talking about concentrated black populations. And it's also near the bottom when it comes to the poorest kind of cities in the country. And so what Maynard Jackson runs on, his platform that year, is pro-civil rights and anti-poverty. It's one thing to run a campaign and talk a good talk, and it's another thing to really deliver on those words. And early on in his mayor career, he hadn't really done anything outside of a few feel-good stunts. He flipped a few burgers at fast food restaurants. He stayed at a public housing project overnight. But really, that's not doing much to put people to work or address the issue of inequality. And so at the time, Atlanta was breaking ground, or trying to break ground, on a new multi-billion-dollar state-of-the-art airport. And Maynard Jackson understood this to be a unique opportunity to address the issue of both civil rights and economic inequality. Before he would sign off on the project, and they needed his signature as the mayor, he insisted that 22% of the people that would constitute of the workers would have to become from a minority background. Okay, broadly defined. Now, is this a quota? Well, yes. Does it have an upside? Yes. Those 22% of people that are of minority backgrounds, that's really servicing the people that need those jobs the most, especially in a place like Atlanta. Does this have a downside? Of course, it's got a downside, and a relatively significant one. On the one hand, this is not the way that affirmative action was supposed to work. It's not supposed to be 22% or 42% or 10%. It's not supposed to be a percentage. The other problem that approaching affirmative action this way will lead to is ultimately it's an undoing. Around about the same time in California, there was a young white man that sued the University of California at Davis for what he considered to be reverse discrimination. Like Atlanta's airport construction, the University of California at Davis was emphasizing diversity, and this individual that had applied to their medical school argued, and successfully I might add, that he had been discriminated against solely because he was male and he was white. In other words, it would have been much, much easier for individuals from, shall we say, lesser represented groups that were not as qualified as he alleged that he was. In any case, he wins this lawsuit, and what this really does is it sets the stage that we went through, not only in places like the University of Texas, but also places like the University of Michigan, its law school in particular, that while this system that you're using to admit undergraduates and graduate students, it's not necessarily a 22% quota per se, but there's a lot of things that really make it seem like it's a quota. And so this is going to be part of the downside, part of the problem, I would say, with respect to the implementation of affirmative action. Does affirmative action have things to like about it when it comes to the addressing of civil rights in American life? Absolutely. But it's a delicate balancing act when it comes to its implementation and how you go about executing it. Okay. This will not be the last time that we talk about civil rights and the enforcement of civil rights in American life, but what I want to leave you with right now on the social side of things, there's an awful lot of burning questions that begin to develop in the 1970s. They'll continue on in the 1980s, and in a lot of ways we still struggle with them in our current era. But what you're going to see develop out of the 1970s from a social, and later on when I talk about the economic side of this, is really going to set the stage nicely for politicians like Ronald Reagan to develop and really shift the political discourse in our country, and ultimately kind of do the same thing that Franklin Roosevelt had done in the 1930s, really replace the dominant political party with a new political party, that being the Republican Party. And that's where we'll pick it up the next time we meet.